What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Yesterday we talked a lot about Spider-Man 4 and how it's going to be a lot different than we originally thought it was going to be and how Marvel Studios originally planned it to be. If you didn't hear before, Sony was basically trying to interfere with what Marvel Studios wanted for the next Spider-Man film. Sony wanted it a very certain way, but Marvel wanted it essentially the opposite. Sony wanted a big multiversal film with Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire returning, the three Spider-Mans reuniting. They basically wanted to take full advantage of Marvel Studios being in the multiverse saga, and they wanted to ride the same hype that Spider-Man No Way Home had. Ultimately, things kind of worked out in Sony's way because Marvel Studios is going to release Spider-Man 4 between Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars. So everybody kind of won. Sony won and Marvel Studios won because they're making the movie kind of their own way. And now Sony gets a big multiversal film. However, a new report states that Sony is interfering with Marvel Studios in a different way. A new report states that any villain that is introduced in Sony's Spider-Man universe, their Spider-Man adjacent films, cannot be used in the MCU, cannot be used by Marvel Studios at all. So basically right now, Kraven the Hunter is coming out. He is a Spider-Man villain. Now, the MCU cannot use Kraven in the MCU at all. He can't be used. He's not available to use. And we've actually heard a rumor about this from people who actually worked on the movies, specifically mentioning Spider-Man No Way Home. They said that Sony said they cannot use Kraven, not before Sony, but now it sounds like if Sony uses a character, then Marvel can't use them at all. And we're going to dive deep into what this means for the future of our Spider-Man, Tom Holland's Peter Parker, and his story in the MCU. Luckily, I don't think it's going to be too bad. However, it is kind of a bummer. This report is originally coming from Daniel RPK, who stated, whenever Sony uses a villain, they block Marvel Studios from using them, which means there aren't many left for MCU Spider-Man to face off against. Now, real quick, let's address Venom, because I know a lot of people are wondering about this. I don't think Venom is technically classified as a villain. In all of the Venom movies, he is the hero, or at least the anti-hero. And this specifically says villains in this report. However, this might actually explain a lot of confusion that we as fans have been having recently about Venom, about the symbiote itself, not necessarily Tom Hardy's Venom, but the Venom symbiote, and Tom Holland's Peter Parker getting that symbiote. Now, I should state that if you're not aware, Sony does own the rights to use Spider-Man. They let the MCU use Spider-Man in the MCU in a joint deal. They obviously get a lot of money for that. And it was very confusing when we got the post-credit scenes for Venom Let There Be Carnage and Spider-Man No Way Home, where the symbiote apparently went over to the MCU. Tom Hardy's Venom and Eddie Brock were in the MCU for a moment as well, but in a punch to the gut, they took him back and put him back in the Sony Spider-Verse. But the symbiote was left over. However, in the trailer for Venom The Last Dance, they seemingly had that symbiote at that same bar in the Venom universe, making us believe that the symbiote wasn't necessarily in the MCU. Maybe they changed their plans, and this kind of rule that they have now with their villains could explain that. Perhaps Venom isn't really available to Marvel Studios at this point in time. However, I will say, they can always make a deal. Contracts are just agreements between different parties, so Sony and Marvel could make a new contract that allows them to use the Venom symbiote in the MCU. And I'm sure Sony would find this pretty beneficial since Tom Hardy is done with Venom after The Last Dance. I would say they're not going to turn around right away and do a new Venom in their Sony Spider-Verse, but it's Sony. You really never know what they're going to do. But you'd imagine they would let Marvel Studios use the Venom symbiote in the MCU and let Peter Parker get that symbiote, which we do believe is the plan right now. Even though the trailer for The Last Dance is very confusing, we still believe that there is a Venom symbiote in the MCU, and Peter Parker will get that in Secret Wars. And the reason we believe that is because that is how it happens in the comics. Peter Parker / Spider-Man gets the Venom symbiote for the first time during Avengers Secret Wars. Now he might even get it in Spider-Man 4 because, like I mentioned in the beginning, it sounds like Spider-Man 4 is going to take place between Avengers Doomsday Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars. And from what we've heard, another report from Daniel RPK, everything that happens between Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars, all of the movies and shows that take place in between, they're all going to take place on Battleworld, which makes sense because most of us do believe that at the end of Avengers Doomsday, the Avengers will lose, Doom will win, and he will form Battleworld. And I actually think it would be a really cool perspective to see everybody dealing with the destruction of the multiverse, and now everybody from a bunch of different universes are in the same place. And it sounds like Spider-Man 4 is going to be right in the middle of that, dealing with everything. So if Sony doesn't interfere, that's when he could get the symbiote. The problem is, it sounds like Sony really is still interfering with what Marvel can and can't do in regards to Spider-Man characters. And if this report is true, then that means, and everybody take a moment of silence here to mourn this, we're never going to get Morbin time in the MCU. I know fans are devastated, but that is essentially what this report means. No Morbius or anybody from Morbius in the MCU. Nobody from Madam Web in the MCU. Not that we would have really wanted that, but the Spider-Women, yeah. And they're not villains, so maybe we still could get that. That also means no Carnage, which I'm not really sure that was a part of Marvel Studios' plans anyways, but that's what this means. So Sony is still trying to essentially control what happens with the Spider-Man characters, which is kind of baffling when you consider the success that Spider-Man himself has had in the MCU, with the Homecoming trilogy, with all of the Avengers movies, with Civil War, which was basically an Avengers movie. Spider-Man has just had massive success in the MCU. And you would really imagine that Sony would just go, yeah, hey, Marvel Studios, whatever you want to do, whatever you think is best is what we should do, so we can all make money instead of having flops like Madam Web and Morbius. But unfortunately, it seems like they continue to want to interfere, and this is most likely because they want to maintain the rights to Spider-Man and have full control over what anybody can do with Spider-Man. I mean, Dakota Johnson basically outed Sony and said that the people at Sony who are making these movies aren't filmmakers, they're executive people who basically just look at numbers, which is unfortunate because that's not how you make, I'll say, good movies or shows for that matter. She even said Sony is disconnected from their audience and their fans. They have no idea what they want, which you can pretty much tell based off of what we've seen and everything that we've really heard. So sadly, I don't think they're going to really give Marvel Studios full control over anything with Spider-Man anytime soon or possibly ever. Luckily for us, the future of Spider-Man in the MCU doesn't really depend on anything that Sony has really done in the past, especially if you consider the drastic change to the Spider-Man 4 story that Marvel Studios recently made because Robert Downey Jr. is now returning to the MCU as Dr. Doom. This puts Marvel Studios in a pretty good position with Spider-Man because now Spider-Man 4's main villain is not going to be Kingpin, and the movie isn't going to be the grounded street-level movie that it was going to be before. It's now going to take place on Battleworld, we assume, if these reports are all correct. So it's going to be a pretty decent-sized multiverse story. But the good news is, after Secret Wars, when we go into Spider-Man 5, that is where we can have Kingpin be a villain. And we've even heard from insider Alex Perez that Otto Octavius, Dr. Octopus, and Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, are coming to the MCU, our own versions of them. Not super soon, but they are coming eventually. So right there, we have three really big villains that could all happen after Secret Wars. So Spider-Man, the story of Spider-Man in the MCU, isn't really at jeopardy because of this. It is annoying that Sony still wants to interfere with the MCU, what they can and can't do, but luckily Marvel Studios right now is in a great position, not only with Spider-Man, but with everything really. So right now we really don't have to worry too much about Spider-Man villains because we seem to be set with the villains. However, what we do have to look out for in the future, well, what Marvel Studios has to look out for, is Sony pushing their own agendas and possibly holding characters back like Miles Morales or Spider-Gwen. That's kind of Sony's big threat right now, is that they do control all of these characters and we can't actually get a true Spider-Man world with all of the Spider-Man characters without Sony's permission. So for Miles to come, for Gwen to come, Black Cat, Spider-Woman, Venom, all of that is up to Sony. And that's an even bigger threat than not having the villains, because Marvel Studios has access to a lot of villains that can be Spider-Man villains. And like I said, Kingpin's already there, and it looks like Doc Ock and Norman Osborn are going to be coming. Like, we're set there. They can even do some type of Sinister Six, especially if Venom does come to the MCU. It's not hard to scrape together a Sinister Six from Marvel characters as well as the Sony ones that Marvel has access to. So for the most part, I think we are good, but to build out a full Spider-Man world in the MCU after Avengers Secret Wars, that unfortunately still is kind of in the hands of Sony and what they'll allow Marvel to do. It seems like over time we learn more and more about what their deal is and what the restrictions are, and it just makes you wish that Sony would just let Marvel Studios do whatever they want, give them access to whatever they want, still give them money for it. They can keep the rights to the characters because we know Sony's never going to give that up, but give full creative control to Marvel Studios so we can get the Spider-Man world in the MCU that we deserve. But again, the future for our immediate Spider-Man, Tom Holland Spider-Man, is very bright and I think is going to be very, very exciting. And hopefully Sony plays ball and lets Marvel Studios do what they want. But go ahead, let me know your thoughts about this in the comments down below. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date on all things with Spider-Man and of course the MCU. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. Woof woof.